You see, we have been conditioned over centuries to worship Christ as a singular historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, and Buddha as Siddhartha Gautama, the enlightened one who broke free from the cycles of suffering. But what if these figures were never meant to be venerated as individuals, but rather as embodiments of states of being, of spiritual awakenings that all of us are capable of experiencing? As we dive deeper into this revelation, I want you to ask yourself what changes in your own spiritual path if Christ and Buddha are not individual people but titles that represent higher states of consciousness. This question alone has the power to shatter the very foundations of how we've come to understand spirituality. And perhaps that's exactly what needs to happen.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lessons.
Let's start with Christ. The word Christ is derived from the Greek word Christos, meaning the anointed one, but it's important to note that in ancient traditions, to be anointed wasn't a designation given to only one person. It was a state of being bestowed upon individuals who had reached a certain level of spiritual realization. The term Christ doesn't belong exclusively to Jesus. It's a title that refers to anyone who has reached the highest state of spiritual anointing, a person who is fully aligned with divine will. In this sense, Christ is a title, a state of consciousness that can be realized by anyone, including you. So the real question becomes, what does it mean to be Christ? To be Christ is not about performing miracles, turning water into wine, or raising the dead. Those are metaphors, symbolic representations of deeper truths. To be Christ is to be fully immersed in the present moment, to embody unconditional love, to surrender the ego and align with a higher purpose that transcends individual identity. Christ, in this sense, is the archetype of the awakened human, a model for what we all can become if we fully realize our potential as divine beings in human form. But that's not the way history has told the story, is it? Over the centuries, we've turned Christ into a distant, unreachable figure. We've placed Jesus on a pedestal so high that the idea of embodying Christ consciousness seems impossible for the rest of us mere mortals. And that's where we've gone wrong. The title of Christ was never meant to belong to just one person. It was meant to be a pathway for all of us. You might ask, if Christ is not just one person, then what do I do with the story of Jesus? The answer is simple but profound: you honor it, but not by worshiping the man as a singular divine being. You honor the story by understanding that Jesus' life was a teaching, an example of what it means to embody the Christ consciousness. His message wasn't, "Look at me, I am the only Son of God." His message was, "You too are the children of God. What I am, you can be." Once you see Christ as a title, a role that can be fulfilled by anyone who reaches a certain level of spiritual awakening, the entire narrative shifts. Suddenly, the message becomes more accessible, more practical. Suddenly, you realize that you are being invited to walk the same path. Christ isn't out there, Christ is within you, waiting to be awakened. And this brings us to Buddha. Like Christ, the Buddha was never meant to be seen as just one man, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived thousands of years ago. The term Buddha means the awakened one, but here's the catch: there have been many Buddhas, and there will continue to be more. The Buddha isn't a singular historical figure. It's a title given to anyone who awakens from the illusion of separateness, from the cycle of suffering, and enters into a state of enlightenment. It's the same archetypal journey as Christ, but with a different cultural lens. Just as Christ represents a state of consciousness aligned with divine love and purpose, Buddha represents a state of enlightenment, the cessation of suffering, the realization of the interconnectedness of all things. Buddha is not one person. Buddha is a title, a state of being that is available to each of us. But let me ask you something. What does it mean for your own spiritual journey if you understand that Buddha is not an isolated historical figure, but a potential that lies within you? What if you understood that the Buddha nature is not something that happened once, a long time ago, but something that is happening now, within you, as you awaken to the truth of who you really are? This is the shocking reveal. Christ and Buddha are not people, they are titles, roles, archetypes of spiritual awakening that we are all invited to embody. The moment we stop seeing these figures as distant, unreachable gods and start understanding them as examples of what we are capable of, everything changes. You might be wondering, why have we been told these stories in such a way that makes these titles seem so unattainable? Why have religions built entire structures of worship around the idea that Christ and Buddha were singular figures, special and unique? The answer lies in the way human beings are wired. We have a tendency to create hierarchies, to place others on pedestals, and to make gods out of people who simply embodied what we are all capable of embodying. In doing so, we distance ourselves from our own divinity. But here's the thing: you don't need to place Christ or Buddha on a pedestal. You don't need to see them as unattainable figures of worship. You need to see them as mirrors, reflections of your own highest potential. Now that we understand Christ and Buddha as titles, not people, we can begin to shift the way we relate to them. We stop worshiping them as distant gods and start embracing them as models for our own spiritual growth. We realize that we too can awaken to the Christ consciousness, that we too can become Buddhas. And this realization changes everything. It breaks down the walls of separation that religion has built between the divine and the human. It shows us that the divine is not out there, somewhere in the heavens, but right here, within us, waiting to be realized. It reminds us that the journey of awakening is not reserved for a select few, but is available to anyone who is willing to walk the path. So now I ask you, what would it mean for you to awaken to your own Christ or Buddha nature? What would it look like for you to live as Christ, not as a follower of Jesus, but as a being fully aligned with divine love and purpose? What would it look like for you to live as Buddha, not as a disciple of Siddhartha Gautama, but as an awakened being, free from suffering, fully aware of the interconnectedness of all life? As we move forward, we'll explore exactly how we can begin to embody these titles in our everyday lives. But before we continue, I want you to sit with this question: what if Christ and Buddha are not distant historical figures, but states of consciousness that are available to you right now? Let's continue our journey into this profound realization. You've probably been sitting with the question, what if Christ and Buddha are not distant historical figures, but states of consciousness that are available to you right now? This question changes everything, because it forces us to look within ourselves, rather than outward, for the source of our spiritual awakening. You see, awakening to your own Christ or Buddha nature is not about becoming something you're not. It's about realizing what you've always been but have forgotten, both Christ and Buddha. represent archetypal states of being that point us to the same truth. The divine is not something external that we need to seek out. It is already within us, waiting to be realized. But how do we begin this process of awakening? How do we start to embody the Christ consciousness or the Buddha nature in our everyday lives? The first step is to deeply understand that both Christ and Buddha are paths of awakening, and these paths are not linear, nor are they easy. They require commitment, self-reflection, and the willingness to let go of everything we think we know about ourselves and the world. Let's start with Christ consciousness. To embody Christ is to embody unconditional love, compassion, and forgiveness. But here's the thing, it's not about trying to be perfect or saintly. It's about recognizing that love is the foundation of everything. It's about seeing the divine in every person you meet, even in those who hurt you, even in those you don't understand. But loving unconditionally is one of the hardest things to do, isn't it? The human ego thrives on judgment, separation, and fear. We categorize people as good or bad, deserving or undeserving, based on how they treat us or how they align with our values. Christ consciousness asks us to transcend all of that. It asks us to love without conditions, without expecting anything in return. And that's where the real challenge lies. You might be wondering, how can I possibly love someone who has hurt me or caused me pain? This is where the Christ path becomes transformative. It's not about loving from a place of personal emotion. It's about loving from a place of deep spiritual awareness, recognizing that every person is a reflection of the divine, even when they are lost in their own suffering. When you begin to see others through this lens, something incredible happens. You start to heal the very wounds that have caused you so much pain. Forgiveness, compassion, and love are not just gifts we give to others, they are gifts we give to ourselves. Christ taught us that to truly live in alignment with the divine, we must surrender the ego. The ego wants to control, to judge, to separate. But the Christ consciousness invites us into unity. It invites us to see that, beneath the surface of our differences, we are all connected. We are all expressions of the same divine energy. To embody Christ consciousness is to live from this understanding. Now, let's talk about Buddha nature. To awaken to your own Buddha nature is to awaken to the truth of impermanence, to the reality that everything in this life, our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies, our experiences, is constantly changing. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is permanent. And that's where our suffering comes from, the belief that things should stay the same, that we can hold on to anything in this world. Buddha nature invites us to let go of this attachment. It invites us to see that suffering arises when we cling to things that are meant to pass away. Buddha's teachings are not about escaping the world or denying our humanity. They are about seeing the world as it truly is, fluid, ever-changing, and ultimately beyond our control. And when we can see this clearly, we begin to release the attachments that cause us so much pain. But how do we apply this to our everyday lives? How do we awaken to our Buddha nature in a world that seems so full of distractions, desires, and suffering? The first step is mindfulness. Mindfulness is the practice of being fully present in each moment, without judgment, without attachment, When you are mindful, you begin to see that each moment is perfect as it is. You no longer need to grasp at things, because you understand that everything is temporary, everything is flowing. You might ask yourself, what attachments am I holding on to that are causing me suffering? Is it an attachment to a person, a relationship, a material possession? or even an idea of who you think you should be. Buddha nature asks us to examine these attachments, not with judgment, but with curiosity. What are we clinging to, and why? The more we practice letting go, the more we open ourselves to the peace that comes from non-attachment. It doesn't mean we stop caring or become indifferent to the world. On the contrary, it means we care more deeply, but from a place of non-attachment. We begin to see that the world is not something to be controlled or resisted. It is something to be experienced fully, with open-hearted acceptance. This is where the paths of Christ and Buddha converge. Christ teaches us to love unconditionally, to forgive, to see the divine in all things. Buddha teaches us to let go of attachment, to see the impermanence of all things, and to live in a state of mindfulness. Together, these two paths offer a complete blueprint for spiritual awakening. And here's the most profound realization of all: you don't have to choose between Christ consciousness and Buddha nature. They are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they complement each other perfectly. To embody Christ consciousness is to live with unconditional love. To embody Buddha nature is to live with non-attachment. When you bring these two together, you create a life of deep spiritual balance. But this raises a deep question for you to consider. How can you embody both unconditional love and non-attachment in your life? This is the ultimate spiritual challenge. To love deeply without clinging, to care without controlling, to be fully present without grasping at outcomes. The awakening to your own Christ and Buddha nature is not something that happens all at once. It's a gradual unfolding, a deepening of awareness that happens over time, through practice, through reflection, through moments of insight and growth. But the potential is within you. The titles of Christ and Buddha are not reserved for a select few. They are invitations to all of us.